As usual, I'm very happy to be with you here. This time in Miskolc. Honestly, this is my first time in this beautiful city. I haven't managed to take a short walk and to take a look in the main street. Probably this is the main street. I saw just a part of it. I'll do this later, but I see that the city is definitely beautiful. Okay, let me get to the point. I'm going to talk about the infringement procedure, but not the infringement procedure as a legal solution, but in the context of applying this procedure against the Central European countries. Maybe I'll start from such a reflection. Well, ensuring compliance of the legal orders of the member states and the European Union remains conditional on the desire to strengthen the European Union as a political and legal organization. There is no doubt that if Europeans want to tighten the framework of transnational cooperation and express interest in further expanding the ties connecting them, they must strive to ensure that the EU legal space is tight as possible, as possible, and that individual countries adapt their legislation to acquis communautaire. Activities in this field are certainly a key factor in the integration process and serve to remove existing barriers. The development of the European Union and its gradual transformation into an increasingly homogeneous entity depends on making their law more compliant with the EU law. There is no doubt about it. And of course, the process of implementation and proper application of the European law may encounter, and in practice often encounters, certain difficulties. After all, it is impossible to expect that in an organization of 27 countries it will proceed uninterrupted and be fully successful in every case. This is all the more justified because Europe has been always characterized by the diversity and strong legal individualism of its member states. And the barriers which result of it still have a negative impact on the implementation of EU law at the national level to this day. Problems related to the implementation of EU law naturally also concern the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, which have joined the Union relatively recently. These countries, like all the members, face their own internal difficulties, and at the same time, when pursuing specific particular policies, they often prioritize and serve their own interests. Therefore, their political agenda may, in this respect, be separated from the need to adapt their legislation and the modus operandi in its application to EU law. When talking about the countries of Central and Eastern Europe in the context of ensuring compliance of the law of member states with EU law, we cannot forget about the long path that these countries have taken after the fall of communism to join the European Union. Aspiring to be a part of this organization, they undertook a huge effort in the 90s to transform their own legal order and reorient it towards modern free market democracies. And this process took place in close cooperation with the European Union institutions and was carried out with a systemic and permanent involvement of both parties. It resulted in profound transformation, which meant the rejections of outdated solutions of the socialist period, and the adoption of regulations consistent with EU law. And of course, in each case, it was individual, and its goal was to properly shape the legislation of particular countries. However, it cannot be ignored that due to the common historical heritage, including the most recent experiences of the region in this part of Europe, it largely encountered the same problems and faced similar obstacles. This inevitably facilitated actions taken by EU institutions and national authorities. As it's known, the accession negotiations of the indicated countries were in all cases a complete success. The degree to which national legislation was compatible with EU law was praised, stating that candidates from Central and Eastern Europe were up to the challenge. There were differences in this respect, but they were not significant enough to affect the ability of countries with the lowest level of implementation to obtain membership. Peter Hill and Christopher Neal wrote about this issue in the past, underlining that, let me make a quotation, those countries that had applied for membership of the European Union during the 90s have undergone transformation of unprecedented scope and speed in order to bring their economic and political structures in line with EU standards. This implied far-reaching reforms of legislation, administration, and macroeconomic policies. Most scholars agree that this process has been driven by the conditionality of EU membership and its prospective gains for the candidate countries. However, the candidate countries have not carried out reforms at a steady pace and with equal success, both between countries and across time. Variation has occurred in the implementation of the acquis communautaire. Well, fulfillment of the obligations to harmonize national orders with European law, which resulted in membership of the European Union in 2004 and 2007, respectively, opened a new phase in the operation of freshly accessed member states and thus brought new challenges. I mean, the need to seek compliance of the national law with the European law. From that moment on, these states, like the other countries of the so-called Old 15, took on the permanent burden of shaping the legal system already as a part of the community. This entailed staying active. This meant staying active in several areas. In particular, areas like adapting their legislation to European law in the areas covered by the transition periods, introducing on an ongoing basis solutions appearing in the EU legal systems and requiring implementation, developing further national orders towards the alignment with the requirements and standards of the EU law, exercising caution in the process of drafting their own regulations so as not to violate community rules, implementing finally the rulings of the Court of Justice of the European Union, forcing changes in national legislation, which force changes in national legislation. And of course, the steps taken in this regard have not been without problems and difficulties, although for the most part they showed goodwill on the part of the states in question and evidenced commitment to the legal integration process of the Union. Some of them were judged by the EU institutions to be incompatible with European law and consequently subjected to infringement procedures provided by the Treaty of the Function of the European Union. This was already evident in the period of immediately following accessions. As Laura Borisova notes, the infringement procedure was of crucial importance to the new member states, and by the way, also this is a quotation of high relevance to the candidate countries that have applied for accession to the Union. On the one hand, they have to adopt the whole acquis upon accession with only few transitional periods granted in a limited number of areas. New member states have already submitted a large number of transposition notifications to the Commission. On the other hand, and despite their huge efforts, new members experience considerable difficulties in implementing directives and other EC legislative instruments. The process of implementation is a challenging stumbling block for all new member states. This is what the author said. The situation did not change also in the further course of European integration, especially already after the adoption of the Lisbon Treaty. Problems related to failure and to comply with European law continued to arise in more than one case triggering an infringement procedure. The predominant case were, as before, those determined by difficulties in implementing directives, although these were compounded, and this was undoubtedly a novelty, by cases based on axiological, social, cultural, and constitutional differences, especially those dividing the liberal West from the conservative East. The latter were generally the result of tensions between the European Commission and individual members, and involved the deliberate pursuit by national authorities of their own policies. They often resulted from pursuit of their own interests and at the same time to defend their own point of view on certain issues. This was clear evidence that efforts to ensure the compatibility of national law with European law need not necessarily take place in an important atmosphere, in an atmosphere of consensus. On the contrary, they can give rise to numerous and serious animosities in relations between member states and the European Union. We could see it clearly in some of the cases to which Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic, also Slovakia, were parties. These countries, in the context of numerous infringement procedures, initiated against them, sometimes against several of them simultaneously, in the same time, clearly resisted to the Commission's request, evading the obligation to adapt their legislation or the practice of their public institutions to the recommendations proposed by the Commission, or alternatively fulfilling this obligation with great reluctance. Their attitude resulted in the Commission's actions ending with different results and at different stages of the infringement procedure. In the case of Hungary, for example, there have been very high-profile situations where this procedure was triggered in the context of accusations by the European Commission. For example, the rule of law, infringement of media freedom, undermining the independence of Hungarian judiciary, violation of the principles of European migration law, or limiting the principle of democracy and the electoral rights of EU citizens. In the case of Poland, such situations mainly included disputes with the European Commission relating to the reform of the justice system, in which a key allegation was made of violating the principle of independence of the judiciary, although there were also high-profile cases of discrimination against sexual minorities in migration law. Finally, in the case of Czech Republic and Slovakia, cases of violation of the rights of national minorities, in particular the Roma minority, have become covered by the infringement procedure. When mentioning the above cases, it is worth being aware that resorting to the infringement procedure is this type of disputes has had and still has negative consequences. There is no doubt that in the eyes of many inhabitants of Central and Eastern Europe, accustomed to their own legal and political traditions, this procedure may appear as an instrument not only for eliminating violations of law and guaranteeing its uniform application throughout the Union, but also providing the possibility of excessive interfering with the sovereignty of individual member states, and as a result leading to an imbalance where what results from treaty obligations and what constitutes the inviolable sphere of given state's internal affairs. This applies especially to cases where the indicated procedure is in use to enforce compliance with EU law regulations that are described in an imprecise manner or refer only to axiology. It is in this situation that conflicts most often arise, causing strong resistance on the part of the member states, and it is in them that they become the greatest source of controversy regarding the permissible limits of the European Union encroachment on the area of state sovereignty. And it's obvious that where there are possibilities or very flexible interpretation of the content of the law, and at the same time the preferred EU values conflict with national values, there may be differences of opinion, and as a result, insubordination of the member states. Such a probability increases, especially when the European Commission conducting the infringement procedure, reaching for controversial legal basis and losing sight of the local specificity of a given member state, enters into a confrontation with governments far from its political line. Then the mentioned insubordination becomes a completely real scenario. And we could see that a couple of times in the case of given countries. The indicated method of using the infringement procedure, which involves putting member states under pressure and imposing a specific agenda on them, may paradoxically, well, it is a paradox, lead to effects different than those intended. Contrary to the intentions of the Commission, which seeks to strengthen the community both politically and legally, it may cause dysfunctions in the functioning of the European Union and even trigger disintegration tendencies within it. The greatest threat in this respect concerns, obviously, the relations between the member states of Western Europe and the member states of Central and Eastern Europe. The risk of conflicts and frictions between both groups of countries is undoubtedly the highest due to the differences between them. Thank you very much for your attention.